Let's review the RPZ zone data file for our RPZ zone bad domains. The configuration file is located at /var/namd/db.baddomains.rpz. This zone data file is like any bind zone data file. Here we have defined TTL for this entire domain or for this entire zone. This is 2 hours. Then we have defined the RPZ domain name. Here it is bad domains dot. Then this is the startup authority section for this RPZ zone or RPZ domain bad domains. So the startup authority for this zone is ns1.test.rl. This is the email address of the zone administrator. We can also read it as postmaster@test.rl, and this is the serial number for this zone. This is 1. Then this is the zone refresh time, which is 12 hours. Then zone retry time, it is 15 minutes. Then zone expiry time, it is 3 hours. Then this is the negative cache time, that is 2 hours. Now the name server for this zone is ns1.test.rl. These are our actual firewall configuration settings. Let's review them one by one. Here is the first rule where the trigger name is QName and the response is NX domain. Here we are killing the entire domain example.org. Means any query comes for example.org will not be answered. Instead, the DNS server will send the NX domain response to the DNS client. So we write it as example.org cname then dot, and also for anything under example.org it is *example.org cname dot. The second rule is to send NX domain for the DNS query comes under baddomains.com. This is similar to the above rule, *baddomains.com cname then dot. Dot is nothing but equivalent to NX domain. Now this is the third rule where the trigger name is QName and the action is no data. No data action means the answer which will be returned to the DNS client will not contain any data. Here we are killing the whole domain badurl.com. So we write it as badurl.com cname *dot. *dot is nothing but equivalent to no data. Then for anything under badurl.com we write it as *badurl.com cname *dot. So this rule will trigger no data action whenever a DNS query comes for badurl.com. Now this is the fourth rule where we are sending no data action to anything under amazon.com. We write it as *.amazon.com cname *dot. Fifth rule is we are defining a pass-through rule for aws.amazon.com. So anything under amazon.com would get no data response, but the query for aws.amazon.com will be answered properly as part of the pass-through action. The sixth rule is to drop any DNS query for facebook.com. That means DNS server will not provide any response or DNS server will not answer anything if the query is for facebook.com. We write it as facebook.com cname rpz -drop dot. Then for anything under facebook.com it is *.facebook.com cname rpz -drop. This is the rule for a truncated action, which means the DNS client will be forced to use TCP protocol instead of default UDP protocol to get the answer from the DNS server for twitter.com. So we write it as twitter.com cname rpz -tcp -only dot. Then for anything under twitter.com it is *.twitter.com cname rpz -tcp only. This is an example of local data action where we are sending a custom response to the DNS client. This example is for alpha.com. So if any query comes for alpha.com or any query comes for anything under alpha.com would get a custom response that is www.redhat.com. Means the DNS client, instead of receiving the actual IP address for the alpha.com, they would be redirected to www.redhat.com. Or we can also redirect the response to a dedicated IP address. For example, this is an example for test.com or for anything under test.com. So if the query comes for test.com, we provide a modified response that is 192.168.50.1. We write it as test.com a 192.168.50.1, then asterisk.test.com a 192.168.50.1. This is an IP trigger for a network subnet 192.168.250.0. Means any DNS answer that contains the IP address that belongs to this particular subnet 192.168.254.0, the response would be NX domain from the DNS server to the DNS client. So we write the network prefix first, then the network in the reverse format, then the trigger is RPZ-IP, then CNAME, then dot. This is an example of client IP trigger. Here we are redirecting any DNS query that comes from 192.168.50.1 IP address to www.redhat.com. So we write it as the prefix, that is 32 for individual IP address, then IP address in the reverse format 1.50.168.192, then the trigger is RPZ-client-IP, CNAME www.redhat.com, or we can redirect to a specific IP address. So we write it as 32 the network prefix, then IP address in reverse format, dot RPZ-client-IP, then A, then the redirected IP address 192.168.50.1. So here any DNS query that comes from 192.168.50.1, that would receive the same answer 192.168.50.1. Now this is a drop action for this client IP address, means we are blocking DNS query specifically from this client. For example, if you want to block internet access to a certain IP address, in that case this particular rule is applicable. So we write it as 32 the network prefix dot an IP address in the reverse format, then RPZ-client IP, CNAME, and the action is RPZ drop. These are some other examples. This is the example of NSDNAME trigger. If any DNS response that contains the answer ns1.dreamhost.com, then the action is NX domain. Means any DNS response that is going out from this DNS server, if that contains the name server for that particular DNS record is ns1.dreamhost.com, that response will be written as NX domain. So we write it as ns1.dreamhost.com.rpz-nsdname cname dot. Again, this will kill any name server from dreamhost.com. Now this is the NSIP trigger, means any DNS response that contains a name server, and if the name server IP address is 14.26.159.168, then the response would be NX domain. So we write it as 32, then the IP address in the reverse format. My bad, I wrote the IP address in the normal format. I should have written it in the reverse format. Then RPZ-NSIP CNAME dot. Remember, these two triggers, that is NSDNAME or NSIP, are blunt weapons. This will completely destroy thousands of domains. Means one DNS server can host thousands of domains, or one IP address that can host thousands of domains. So be careful while implementing these triggers. Now let's see some sample logs. Logs will look like this. So for example.org, the client received NX domain response. This is the specific RPZ logs for the above query. So the log says, for example.org, the DNS client 192.168.50.28 received the rewritten response NX domain via example.org.bad domains. This is another example for www.example.org. The client also received the same DNS response, that is NX domain. This is the specific RPZ log for this DNS query. Now for facebook.com, the DNS client received timed out response, means the query couldn't be answered from the DNS server, or it got timed out. Again, the same response received for www.facebook.com connection timed out. These are the sample logs for all above DNS queries. So for amazon.com or for www.amazon.com, the response is no data, and for aws.amazon.com, the response is pass through. For facebook.com, the response is drop, and for www.facebook.com, the response is drop. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope I was able to explain you something and you understood something. In my next video, I will explain everything on a Linux system by showing all configurations and by doing live testing. I'll catch you in my next video. Thank you so much.